Are monsters born, or are they created? The answer to that question probably lies somewhere between the terms psychopath and sociopath. Any introvert can become such a person. If he makes a few different decisions in his life, he can end up like this person. A person who slaughtered almost 67 innocent lives. What was the reason behind such a horrible act? Why is he called the Monster of China?
死吧，不死了，反正病都到这儿了，死了别这么说。石家庄杀人强奸，听说过？知道了吗？石家庄杀人强奸，无条件还不作死。
恐怕还有吧？
有啊，我给你说吧。
接着说。
一个我给你补好了，现在。
So, without further delay, let's start with the case revolving around Yang Xinhai. In the small village of Guoshuang, north of Zhikou, a city in the central Chinese province of Hainan, the peaceful lives of the villagers suddenly changed on September 19, 2000. Two of the elderly residents were found beaten to death in their homes. Yang Paiman and Shan Laning, who were both in their 70s, were sleeping when a man entered and slaughtered them both to death. The intruder took what little cash he could find and disappeared into the wilderness of the surrounding countryside. The police had few clues as to the identity of the person who ended the lives of the old couple. The brutal slaying would remain unsolved for 3 years until the capture and arrest of New China's most feared and notorious criminal, the man referred to as the Monster of China, Yang Xinhai. The violent deaths of Yang Paiman and Shan Laning marked the first time Yang Xinhai took anyone's life, but it was only the start of his reign of terror across 4 provinces in China. In just under 3 years, he would be responsible for numerous robberies, violations of both women and children, where he didn't discriminate between the living and dead, and the deaths of 67 people. Only 2 days after the incident in Guoshuang, Yang Xinhai got off a bus in Jumadian, a city only 100 kilometers from Zhikou. Along the way, he'd stolen a meter-long set of bolt cutters and intended to put them to use. To look less suspicious carrying the bolt cutters around, he stole a pile of firewood, slipped the cutters in sight, and made his way to another small village in the township of Guanwangmiao. This time, he targeted a small, family-run village store. In rural Chinese villages, it is common for some of the residents to use the front of their homes as small convenience stores for the locals' daily needs. Yang Xinhai believed that there was a guarantee of cash inside these small businesses. As he had done previously, he waited in the surrounding countryside for dark to fall and the village to drift off to sleep. He had already picked out his target, one that seemed to only be run by 2 women. He also knew from his childhood that in small communities where everyone knew each other and much of the village was in some way related, people paid little attention to security. He waited until midnight before making his way to his target. The window of the home was left open but covered by security bars. Yang Xinhai used the bowl cutters to remove 2 of the bars and entered. Any noise made hadn't woken the residents. He first looked in on the women who were sleeping soundly, then began to search for cash. At first, he could only find the equivalent of $20. He wanted to search the room more thoroughly but was concerned about how much time it might take. Picking up one of the bars he'd cut, he quietly approached the sleeping residents. The 3 residents were the 27-year-old homeowner, her 18-year-old sister, and a 4-year-old boy. He smashed each of them about the head with his makeshift weapon. However, the screams from the home roused the doctor from a medical clinic next door. The doctor came with a flashlight in his hand. He shined it on Yang Xinhai, interrupting him mid one of his swings of the bar. Spooked and now faced with someone prepared to fight back, Yang Xinhai left the scene. The doctor tried to chase him and at least get a good look at the attacker. His position as doctor took over knowing people had been hurt. He stopped, called an ambulance, and tended to the injured. Fortunately, the 3 victims survived the assault, and this would be the closest anyone would come to catching the monster. Yang Xinhai escaped into the countryside once more, sleeping outside and stealing food from nearby farms to eat. Being interrupted and almost caught scared him, so he chose to leave Hainan and make his way south to the neighboring province of Anhui. He arrived at Anhui in the city of Fiong on October 1st, and somewhere along the way he'd gotten hold of a bicycle he was now using. The fear of being caught he felt in Jumadian had gone, and he was looking to strike again. Wisely, he chose not to do anything in the more prosperous city, feeling there was more chance of being caught. Instead, he made his way into the rural areas, looking for something that grabbed his attention. He stopped in a village named Zhouying after seeing a 12-year-old girl playing with her younger brother. Yang Xinhai watched them until they went home. The monster had found his next target. The 12-year-old girl and her 7-year-old brother lived with their grandmother, who was 63 years old. Yang Xinhai easily entered the unlocked home at night with a meter-long iron axle he'd found discarded in the village. He smashed the heads of the grandmother and grandson, ending their lives. before going after the granddaughter. He beat her with the iron axle until there were no more signs of life, then truly earned his monster nickname by violating her. He drifted into the countryside after satisfying his desires, and the next morning, the 3 victims were found by a villager who came to ask for some coal. When the police were called, they managed to extract a DNA sample. The monster, at this time, still feared being caught. He spent little time in built-up urban areas to avoid any interaction with the police. Instead, he lived rough in the countryside, bedding down in any place that provided any sort of shelter and stealing food from farms to sustain himself. He wasn't on the authorities' radar at all. As he had no job and didn't register an address, he was effectively an anonymous person. After the incident in Pyongyang, he wouldn't make his presence felt again until 9 months later, back in his home province of Hainan. In August 2001, he was in the city of Luai, around 70 kilometers north of the scene of his first major crime, Jumadian. On the 15th of that month, he rode a newly stolen bicycle to a remote village in the township of Juli. There he quickly picked out a target, a 43-year-old woman who lived with her 11-year-old son and 14-year-old daughter. He looked around the village for a makeshift weapon and found a large iron bar lying around, then waited for nightfall. This time he was also carrying a fruit knife. He silently entered the home of the woman and her 2 children and immediately attacked the mother while she was sleeping, and he killed her with a steel rod. He did the same to her young son, leaving the daughter until last. In minutes, the lives of the 3 innocent people were extinguished, but Yang Xinhai wasn't finished. He violated the corpses of the mother and daughter, and then cut the throats of the 3 victims to ensure they were all dead. There wasn't any attempt to search the home for money. He just took whatever small amount the woman had in her pocket. He disappeared into the countryside once again to continue his life as a murderer. The bodies were discovered the next morning. The police were called, and an investigation began. Hair and semen samples were taken, and the police managed to produce a DNA profile of the invader. The entire population of the village had to give blood samples for testing, but it gave the police no clues about the person they wanted. Yang Xinhai had gotten away with another brutal, horrific attack. The attack in Jilin increased the monster's dead victim count to 8. However, none of his crimes had yet been linked, and the fears Yang Xinhai felt about the police coming for him began to fade. With growing confidence, he started using his crimes as a way for him to vent his anger over any minor issue or inconvenience that bothered him. He never dared to confront the person who troubled him directly. Once his anger built up, he would go looking for someone else to punish. An example of this happened only a month after his previous attack. Back in the city of Zhuku, the area where he took someone's life for the first time, he boarded a bus with no real plan on where he would head next. Getting an empty window seat pleased his mood. That changed when an old woman sat on the seat next to him. He was disgusted that the woman had invaded his personal space. He was filled with rage that he needed to let out. Yang Xinhai ended up in a township named Kanglu on the outskirts of the city. There at night, he broke into a home and ended the lives of the 2 men living there. He beat both men to death and then cut their throats. This time, he would look for money to take. It was one of his better hauls so far, getting away with the equivalent of $41. In December 2001, while staying in Hainan, he went to a village in Yi County on the outskirts of the city of Pingdingshan and broke into the home of a couple nearing their 60s. He beat both the man and woman to death, continuing his habit of cutting the victim's throat. This time there was no trigger, it was purely financially motivated. Once the homeowners were dead, he looked through the house for anything he could take. By the end of 2001, Yang Xinhai was responsible for the homicides of 12 people, and that figure would rise dramatically throughout 2002. On the 6th of January, the monster Yang Xinhai once again targeted Jumadian and the village of Luzhuzuang. In his bloodiest, most brutal attack, he used a hammer, which would become his trademark weapon, to beat 5 members of the same family to death. First, he attacked the male members of the household before going after the women. Once there were no more chances of life for many of his victims, he violated the youngest of the females. On January 27th, Yang Xinhai was now in the county of Tongsu, part of Kaifeng, one of China's 8 ancient capital cities. Looking for someone to steal from, he targeted the home of a family of 3. All 3 were beaten to death with the hammer, with the female victim being violated. The 2 attacks added 8 more to his body count, and it was only the first month of the year. The police in Henan had taken notice of the pattern that had emerged and were in the early stages of connecting the crimes. However, Yang Xinhai was as if he didn't exist. Something kept him in the shadows for almost 6 months, but by June 30th he was back in the city of Zhuku. Walking out of the city into the countryside of Fugu County, Yang Xinhai was now carrying a walking stick he'd fashioned from a tree to help him traverse the terrain and for self-defense purposes. When he came upon a village community that looked suitable, he walked around for a while, looking for a target that looked perfect. He soon spotted a 13-year-old girl who was part of a family of 4. On seeing the girl playing in the village, his evil desires rose. Waiting until nightfall, he entered the home and beat each of the family members to death with the hammer. He then pocketed an amount of money that would be $12 today. The now blood-soaked Yang Xinghai grabbed his walking stick to leave but quickly changed his mind, thinking about the 13-year-old. He dropped the stick and went back inside to violate the corpse once more. When the police arrived the next morning to investigate the scene, they found the walking stick with a bloody palm print on it. They noticed that it was cut from a type of tree that didn't grow in the area. This suggested that an outsider had entered the village. They realized they needed to widen the area of the investigation. The local police reported the crime to the Provincial Public Security Bureau, and the incident was linked to the August 15th incident that took place in Jilin. It was the first time the authorities were sure that the same man was responsible, and they began checking reports of other similar attacks in Hainan. Part of the issue police faced when trying to connect the crimes was a mix of small local police forces under pressure from superiors to solve cases quickly and villagers using it as an opportunity to cause problems for people they'd had a dispute with. Their search for suspects in each case focused on people familiar with the areas. In the very first homicides committed by Yang Xinghai and Guo Shuang back in September 2000, police arrested a villager soon after the discovery of the bodies. Yang Deli owed the male victim money for some cigarettes and had a previous arrest for robbery. Police arrested him with no evidence that he was involved at all but managed to make the man confess to the crime. At trial, he retracted his confession, claiming it was beaten out of him. Fortunately for the innocent man, the courts listened and decided there was nothing to convict him of the homicides, and he was released. Although it had yet to be connected in the October 1st case that took place in Anhui. A similar event occurred. Xu Jiku had several of his pigeons stolen close to the time of the home invasion and homicides. Thinking there may be some connection, he reported the theft to the police. Instead, he fell under suspicion. He had a criminal record for theft and had some conflict with the female victim. The police felt that the reporting of the stolen pigeons was just a way to put them off his scent. Xu Jiku was arrested and spent 5 days being deprived of sleep and beaten to get him to confess. But he refused to admit the crime. Without a confession, the police had less than nothing. The hair and semen samples found at the scene didn't match him, so they tried to get him something else. The police went to search the man's home and found a firearm he used while hunting that wasn't registered. They charged him with possessing an illegal firearm, and Xu Jiku was sentenced to re-education. He served almost 1 year before the sentence was terminated. On returning to the village, he was treated as guilty by most other residents, and a cloud of suspicion hung over him for years. While these were the result of local police pressure for results, in several other cases, despite there being no witnesses, there was no shortage of people prepared to name suspects to the police. This was usually due to disputes over money or other village vendettas that only wanted people they didn't like to be taken away. While police were slowly linking the various assaults and homicides that had taken place, Yang Xinghai was still on the hunt for victims. On the 21st of July, he was in Dengzhou City, Henan, and the town of Menglu. At around midnight, he entered the home of a woman who lived alone and made his way to her bedroom as she slept. His presence caused her to stir awake, and she asked who was in the room. Yang Xinghai put a knife in her throat and nakedly got on top of her. She screamed as he violated her, but her yells went unheard. Once done, the monster got dressed and left, allowing the woman to live. When she reported the assault to the police the next day, due to her terror and panic at the time, she mistakenly thought her attacker spoke with a local village accent. This put the police focus on investigating people in the village rather than looking for an outsider. Since the woman lived alone, she was an easy, weak target, and if he didn't end her life, he believed there would be less importance placed on the incident by the police. Because of this, he stayed in Menglu and searched for more targets. On July 27th, he broke into the home of a family of 4, attracted by their 9-year-old daughter. He killed all the family members with his hammer. However, this attack marked a change in his behavior. He violated the 35-year-old woman's home before ending her life. He then violated the corpse of the 9-year-old girl before cutting the throats of each victim to ensure they were dead. The forensic evidence collected at the scene matched that of other incidents. The police had a DNA profile of Yang Xinghai, but didn't know who he was or where to start looking. Yang Xinghai wouldn't be active again until the 21st of October. Back in Zhuma Dian, a village in the township of Songji, he broke into the well-kept home of a man who lived alone. The appearance of the property gave Yang Xinghai the impression that the owner was well off. His assumption was correct, and he managed to steal about $420. He didn't attempt to do any harm to the old man and left the house, but he was still feeling somewhat unsatisfied with his evening's act. As midnight fell, he entered the unlocked home of a family he'd seen earlier while scouting locations in the village. The home was owned by a married couple and their 6-year-old daughter. He beat each of them with the hammer and violated the young girl. The victims were discovered the next day by the father's older brother. However, this time Yang Xinghai dispensed with cutting his victims' throats. Despite suffering massive head injuries from the hammer blows, the mother survived the assault. Unfortunately, the child she was pregnant with at the time did not. As police investigated the scene, the usual forensic evidence of hair, saliva, and semen was found, as well as something else that linked this to the previous case. Yang Xinghai entered the house shoeless, and he walked around with softer footsteps. The police found a bloody footprint at the scene that didn't belong to any of the residents or the older brother who found the bodies. The same bloody footprint had been left at the scene of the previous homicide. Footprints of all residents in a large radius around all neighboring villages were checked, and while police found a couple of close matches, both men with criminal records, it brought the police no closer to the monster. Yang Xinghai was once again out of sight, sleeping rough in the wilderness. It was as he was sleeping in a field a few days after the last attack that he woke to find the field on fire and a controlled burn by local farmers. If he hadn't woken, he could have easily been consumed by the flames as he slept. This infuriated Yang Xinghai, who wanted to get revenge on anyone for the incident. He went into the closest village and entered a home. When a man confronted him, Yang Xinghai beat him about the head with his hammer. He then stole the money he could find and set the house on fire before leaving. He didn't check to see if he had ended the life of the homeowner. Fortunately, thanks to other villagers' quick response to the blaze, the injured man survived. On the 7th of November, Yang Xinghai was still drifting around Juma Dian, this time in the township of Shadian. The area was more built up than places he'd visited previously, and as he wandered around the town, his fury grew. He fumed over the fact that people were able to live in comfortable homes and eat good food in restaurants, while he felt his own life was that of a stray dog. His self-pitying anger needed somewhere to vent, so he went out into a rural village looking for someone to take it out on. He soon found a target, the home of a family of 4 mother and father with 1 girl and a boy. He bludgeoned each of them with the hammer, violated both the female victims, and searched the property for money but was unable to find much value. Once again, Yang Xinghai didn't make sure his victims were dead with his knife. He left the young daughter of the family alive, and she would go on to recover from her injuries, albeit with the trauma of what happened. He quickly followed that attack with another only a week later. On November 16th, on returning to Kaifeng and heading to a village in the county of Weishi, he took the lives of a grandmother in her 60s and her 14-year-old granddaughter, violating the girl after. 3 days later, on November 19th, he returned to the city of Luai and found himself in a village in Wangmeng Township. There, he attacked and ended the lives of an elderly couple and stole the equivalent of $97. With the attacks coming more frequently, the police response ramped up significantly. Male in cities and townships across Henan were having their fingerprints taken and being told to give blood samples, but Yang Xinghai was out of reach. The police had the man they were looking for in custody on at least 2 occasions. Once, shortly after one of his attacks, he was spotted walking the streets of a neighboring town by patrol police, looking at the dirty, scruffy man in front of them. They suspected he could be a thief and took him in for questioning. Knowing that if he lied about his name, that would put him under further suspicion, Yang Xinghai truthfully gave them his identity and home address. While he was being held, he heard conversations about the last crime he had committed. The police openly talked about the investigation, not realizing the man they were looking for was sitting with them and listening in. The officers seemed to have forgotten Yang Xinghai until he started asking questions. Annoyed by what they considered a vagrant, the police told him to mind his own business and soon kicked him out of the station. Yang Xinghai dared to ask if he could share some of the noodles the officers were eating. His request was dismissed, and he was back out on the streets. The second occasion was when he was found by police sleeping in an abandoned farmhouse. He was using the building to try and get some shelter from the cold winter. He was happy to be taken to a warm police station for the evening. Again, he gave his real name and home address. The following morning, several women were brought into the station to take a look at him. Yang Xinghai wasn't told why the women were brought in to identify him, but he wasn't worried. At that time, none of his victims had survived. The women all said they didn't know him, and once again, Yang Xinghai was released. On December 1st, 2002, Yang Xinghai returned to the city of Zuku and was in the village of Yanwan. He forced his way into the home of a family of 3 once again, a married couple and their young daughter. Both parents were bludgeoned to death. Their daughter was beaten with a hammer and then violated. Before leaving, Yang Xinghai stole $400 from this house. When the scene was discovered the next morning by the adult son, his parents were dead, but his younger sister was still alive, suffering from critical head injuries. After hospital treatment, the girl survived the attack. A special task force had been created, and the various incidents around the province had been linked by forensic evidence. The investigators knew they were looking for one person for the series, but still had no idea who they were looking for. They had DNA evidence from various crime scenes, such as fingerprints and footprints, but unfortunately, no eyewitness descriptions. The few surviving victims of Yang Xinghai were unable to describe the person who tried to end their lives. They were attacked in the dark, either being woken by the sounds of their family members being bludgeoned or hit while they were sleeping. The next attack would happen in a new city in Hainan. On December 13th in Yaningol County in the city of Xuchang, Yang Xinhai attacked a married couple and their young son. He beat the adults first and then moved on to the child. As he was bringing the hammer down onto the son's head, the father tried to get up and stop him. The father's attempts to save his family were in vain, and Yang Xinhai left the home with all family members dead. He needed to steal a change of clothes, as his own had been soaked in blood. Only 2 days later, he struck again, although now he'd left Hainan and returned to the city of Fuoyang in the town of Maichai, Anhui. The home Yang Xinhai targeted was that of a single father raising his 9-year-old son and 13-year-old daughter. The man's wife had passed away some years before. All three were beaten to death, and the daughter was then violated. The bodies were discovered 2 days later by relatives. Strands of hair found on the daughter confirmed that this was done by the same person responsible for the Hainan attacks. However, the police were again behind Yang Xinhai as he left Anhui and returned to Hainan. Till now, he had killed 46 people. This attack marks his last of the year, but it wouldn't be long into 2003 when the monster became active again. In 2003, the task force began a campaign. An award of $14,000 was offered for the information leading up to the arrest. The police released a profile criminal psychologists had put together of the suspect. It stated they were looking for a male aged between 25 and 40, between 1.60 m and 1.67 m in height, and of a thin build. They added that the suspect was familiar with rural life, that he was likely homeless, and that he would have a previous criminal record. The vague profile hindered more than it helped. It would see small police forces in various townships receive hundreds of calls with people suggesting names. As the police did what they could to look at any promising suggestions, none brought them closer to Yang Xinhai. The 2003 Spring Festival brought both potential benefits and drawbacks for the activities of the monster. As people returned home from other provinces to spend the new year with their families, it meant homes would have more cash lying around for them to take, but it also meant that there was a lot more human activity taking place in the village. He stayed quiet until early February. He tried to break into and steal from several homes and villages, but was interrupted by residents and chased off, disappearing into the snowy countryside. He managed to get away with a few hundred RMB, but it wasn't enough to satisfy him. He needed more than just money. On the 5th of February, in Xiangcheng, a county in the city of Pingdingshan, at around 3 in the morning, Yang Xinhai entered the home of a married couple and their 2 children, a son and daughter. The mother, father, and son were all bludgeoned to death. The daughter was beaten and violated. The next morning, as firecrackers rang in the new year in the village and the family didn't appear, concerned villagers went to check. Relatives found the 3 dead bodies, but the daughter had survived and was still breathing. She would live after treatment in the hospital. The attack fulfilled Yang Xinhai, and for the next few days he decided to get out of the cold, snow-laden countryside and use the money he'd stolen to stay in a small, cheap guest house. Although he'd long since lost or dispensed with his identity card, the type of places he chose to stay didn't worry too much about the loss of registering guests. Their clients were usually people who were trying to avoid too much attention, and rooms were generally charged per hour. The relative comfort he lived in for those days still couldn't prevent his desires from rising, and soon enough he returned to Zhuku and went on the hunt for his next victims. Now in a village in the county of Jiawa, on the 18th of February, Yang Xinhai entered the home of 2 girls aged 10 and 13 and their parents. All 4 members of the family were violently exterminated. The 2 sisters were both violated. The bodies of the victims were found 4 days after their deaths. The following month, he would commit his final crime in Hainan. Since the police had been widely publicizing the case, he had seen notices of the profile the task force had created being posted in various towns and cities in the province. And while the profile fit him well, there was also nothing that identified him specifically. So, while he wasn't especially concerned about being arrested, he still felt it was more prudent for him to go to a new area. On the 23rd of March, in the town of Chengguan, in the city of Kaifeng, Yang Xinhai attacked and ended the lives of 4 members of a family, the parents, and their 2 young sons. He violated the mother. The 5th member of the family and his main target, a young daughter, was fortunate enough to be staying with her grandfather at the time, and so became her family's last surviving member. His spree in Hainan alone covered 7 cities around the province, most with multiple incidents that had each taken place in different townships, leaving 51 people dead. This doesn't include the 2 attacks in Anhui. After this, Yang Xinhai headed northwest into the neighboring province of Shandong and the city of Hez, only 128 kilometers away from Kaifeng. Yang Xinhai had grown up in extreme poverty, and as a result, even relatively small amounts of money could make him feel like he was wealthy. However, he spent the money he stole soon after taking it. He was especially fond of spending it in establishments such as bathhouses, spas, barbers, and massage parlors, where women working there offered special services. In the poor Hainan, he rarely had to pay more than 100 RMB for the extras on offer. In the relatively more prosperous Shandong, he discovered things were different. In a massage parlor in Hayes, he demanded full service from the girl he picked out. The woman felt he was too rustic and looked like a dirty vagrant. She told him she was only prepared to offer him hand relief. Although angered and wanting to attack her, he accepted. When the time came to pay, he handed over 100 RMB only to be told the service cost 180. Feeling like he was being cheated, he tried to dispute the price. But the woman, with little time for his arguments, told him to speak to her boss if he had a problem. Furious at feeling bullied, Yang Xinhai begrudgingly handed over the extra 80 and made up his mind to take revenge, but it wouldn't be against the people he felt belonged to. On April 2nd, in the town of Taiyuan, he took his revenge on the Hayes massage parlor by beating to death a couple that had been married for only 100 days. The wife was violated after her death, and she was 3 months pregnant at the time. At first, police in Shandong, not fully aware of the assaults that had taken place in Henan, suspected this was being committed by local gangsters. Once the task force in Hainan was made aware of the incident, they compared the forensic evidence at the scene and added it to the list of crimes perpetrated by Yang Xinhai. China came out in force, checking all people registered in hotels and guest houses, and checkpoints were set up at transport hubs and major roads in the search for the suspect. Then another event hit China that forced Yang Xinhai to hide for some time. Interprovincial travel was severely restricted, and non-local residents were subject to much more stringent checks. To avoid being caught out by this Yang Xinhai, he decided it was better to head back to his home city, Zhumadian, until things eased off. Although he was back in his hometown, he did not attempt to visit his family. He continued to sleep outside, often at bus or train stations, and spent the days drifting around the countryside on the edges of the city. Towards the end of July, the panic was dying down, and restrictions were being lifted. During the health crisis, the search for the monster hadn't been forgotten by police, and they were still posting their profiles of the suspect around cities and towns. Yang Xinhai took the opportunity to leave Hainan once the restrictions were eased. He headed north to another neighboring province, Hebei. He arrived in the city of Xingtai sometime in early August and quickly found a target in a village called Lidao. There he broke into 2 different homes, stealing money from one and the other. He couldn't find any cash but decided to take a hammer he could use. Sneaking around the house, he also saw a young girl sleeping alone. His bloodlust rose on seeing an easy target, but it was close to dawn, and he felt there was more risk of him being caught, so he decided to wait. He left the house and hid the hammer in a nearby haystack, ready for when he returned. On August 5th, he came back into the village but found that the hammer had gone. He searched for another weapon and came across an axe in one of the home's front yards. He took the axe and headed home, where he'd seen the girl sleeping. Attacking them with the axe, he slaughtered the young girl and her parents as they slept after breaking into the home. The 15-year-old daughter was then assaulted after the violent attack. Only days later, on August 8th, in Shijiazhuang, he visited a massage parlor for special services, but the woman serving him demanded to wear a condom. Yang Xinhai tried to refuse, which caused the woman to insult him, saying he was a low-class peasant. Again, he was filled with fury but didn't dare do anything. He would vent his anger later to people unconnected to the incident. In a village on the outskirts of the city, he saw 2 young girls playing outside. He had his target and waited till night. The 2 young girls were part of a family of 5. With the newly bought hammer, Yang Xinhai annihilated the entire family, violating the 2 young girls after their deaths. He then searched the house for money, but the anger and humiliation he felt at the massage parlor came back to him. He decided to take revenge for his perceived humiliation at the massage parlor by mutilating parts of the anatomy of the female victims. The police investigating both crimes in Hebei were quick to inform officers in Hainan, suggesting that both attacks followed the same pattern as the other incidents. The task force convened with their counterparts in Hebei, and details of the man they were looking for were spread around the province. Looking at previous patterns, they were confident the man they were looking for would head to another city. Any locations popular with floating populations were given the profiles of the people to be on the lookout for. They added pressure, which appeared to have a positive effect. There would be no more attacks by Yang Xinhai in the subsequent months, but they were still no closer to finding out what the monster they were looking for was. On November 2nd, 2003, police in the Hebei city of Kangzhou, over 200 kilometers from Shijiazhuang, received a call about a suspicious person staying at a cheap hostel in the city. 2 officers were dispatched to investigate. The guest in question fit the physical description of the suspect, had no identity card when registering to stay, and crucially, had a Hainan accent. The person of interest was staying in room 205. The officers went to the hotel in plain clothes and acted as if they were also guests. Thinking up some reason to knock on the door of 205, they tried to get a look at the resident. They got themselves booked into the room opposite so they could observe the person in the room when he left. It took until the next morning for the suspect to finally leave the room when he went out for breakfast. The officers tailed the suspect as he walked aimlessly through the city, at one point loitering outside a local primary school. The suspect then led them to a street known for being a red light district. The man went into a massage parlor, which offered special services, and had just given the police following him a reason to detain him. Noticing the man following him inside, the suspect panicked and quickly made his way out of a back door to escape. The police gave chase and easily caught up to the man. They arrested him and searched him, with the suspect remaining calm throughout. He was only carrying a fruit knife and 500 RMB in cash. At the police station, the man told his name to be Yang Xinhai, told the police his hometown, and seemed completely unconcerned about his arrest. In the mind of Yang Xinhai, he hadn't yet committed a major crime in Kangzhou, and so he was only being arrested for trying to solicit special services. Due to his past experiences of being arrested, he had no issue telling the police the truth about his identity and was friendly and relaxed. Yang Xinhai waited patiently, expecting that, at the very least, he would be held for 24 hours before being released with a warning or a fine. The police in Kangzhou got in touch with counterparts on the task force, and a team made their way to the city. As he waited, doctors entered the interrogation room and took blood samples from a relaxed Yang Xinhai. Not being knowledgeable about forensics, in his mind he hadn't left any of his blood at any scenes, so their taking blood was unconnected to the crimes he'd committed. Preliminary analysis of the blood showed it was type B, which matched the forensic profile found at the scenes of the crimes in Hainan, Anhui, Shandong, and Hebei. Without being given a reason, police re-entered the interrogation room in force and shackled the ankles and hands of Yang Xinhai, who remained unmoved. As members of the task force arrived at the station, they entered the interrogation room and fixed their eyes on the man in front of them. He was asked, point blank, if he knew anything about the series of homicides in the 4 provinces. Yang Xinhai denied having any involvement. When he was shown the forensic profile and told it was 99% accurate, the monster replied that if it was only 99%, then he was the 1%. After hours of questioning and being shown the evidence against him, interrogators asked how he could deny he was responsible. Yang Xinhai began to crack but remained defiant. He told the police that he couldn't have left hair at every scene, and that if they had evidence he would confess if not. Then they should stop trying to scare him. As they began to get some admission of guilt from the man in front of them, the police wanted to know what created the monster that sat before them. And to get a full picture of the man responsible for the deaths of at least 67 people, Yang Xinhai was born on July 17, 1968, and was a native of Henan Province, once one of the poorest regions in the country. He grew up in Zhengyang, a county belonging to the city of Zhumadian, in a tiny village of only 200 households. Living in poverty was simply a way of life for most people in China at that time, but even compared to that, the poverty suffered by the family of Yang Xinhai was extreme. His childhood home, built by his father, had walls made of soil and a roof made of thatched wheat. His former parents had 2 oxen, who were so vital to their survival, were fed better than the family, and at night lived inside the home. One of his 6 siblings, Yang Xinhai, spent his childhood living in a home that was filled with the dung and urine of the animals. His brothers and sisters all worked in the fields with their parents so that the family could get enough food from the local government. The young Yang Xinhai wanted to change his condition, and when he was only 8 years old, he demanded that his parents send him to school, something. Despite barely being able to afford the education, his father was willing to allow his son to try. Yang Xinhai did surprisingly well in an entrance exam and was admitted into a 2nd grade class. While he worked hard on his learning, school life wasn't easy for him. He was bullied by his classmates. Due to his lack of nutrition, he was physically underdeveloped and was the target of frequent bullying. This led him to sit alone in his classroom or to hide in the toilets when there were breaks between classes. When he was 11 years old, he returned home and he found his mother crying. His father had attempted to end his own life by drinking pesticide. One of his brothers had been caught stealing rapeseed flowers from the village cadres. As a result, the family would have to pay a fine for this, which the family could not afford. The young Yang Xinhai struggled to understand why his family was being punished so harshly for something young children in the village did frequently while out playing. His father recovered after a while, but his young son began to develop a feeling of inferiority and resentment towards the society around him. Regardless, he continued to perform well in school, showing some budding talent in art and literature. He managed to get accepted into a decent high school and seemed to have a dream. However, his poverty was still with him. His school had a canteen, serving food Yang Xinhai had never been able to taste in his life. His friends would eat lunch and dinner there, but Yang Xinhai couldn't afford it. If he wanted to eat, he'd have to make the 6-kilometer round trip to his home for the food. He would occasionally stay with a cousin who lived closer to the school and had a reasonably successful business. But while they allowed him to stay in their home, they would still force him to pay for any food he ate. In 1985, the young Yang Xinhai vanished. He gave no words to his teachers or family. He walked out of the school one day and never returned. It turned out he'd gone to find work at a coal mine. He gave up on education when he saw how much his parents struggled to pay for his tuition fees and came to believe that even if he got accepted into a college, it would be too expensive for them to afford, so he was wasting his time. He spent the next few years drifting around the region, picking up different jobs that were physically demanding but required no qualifications. He struggled with the physical labor, still being somewhat underdeveloped, and didn't see the point of working so hard for such little reward. Especially when bosses would make up reasons not to pay employees for their labor. He then noticed that those engaged in illegal activities seemed to live a better, easier life than those doing honest work. He took to stealing, often from construction sites, and selling what he stole. He would pickpocket people around transport hubs and other busy areas in towns and cities, but was caught by police on several occasions. Sometimes the amounts he stole were small enough for him to receive a warning or a fine. Sometimes he would do stints inside re-education camps. It had been 5 years since he had been back to his hometown, and he didn't intend to go back to visit his family until a chance meeting on a bus. Recently released from a re-education center in Hebei, Yang Xinhai was recognized by someone from the same village. He told Yang Xinhai that his parents missed him and that a girl he once essentially agreed to marry was still waiting for his return. It was especially common in the past for families in Chinese villages to arrange marriages between their offspring. Around the time he was in junior high, Yang Xinhai and a classmate of his had essentially been chosen to marry when they were of age. Due to his performance in school, the young Yang Xinhai was viewed by the girl's family as a good potential husband. On hearing that the girl was still waiting for his return, he agreed to go back. The only other relationship he'd had with a woman, apart from nights he'd pay for, was with the landlady of a room he was renting, who was 10 years his senior. It ended badly when she discovered Yang Xinhai with a woman he'd paid for in his room and threw him out. Going back to his village, he had little interest in spending any time with his family. Little had changed apart from the thatched ceiling, now black with smoke and dripping grease from the cooking his family did. However, any excitement he felt towards meeting his future wife soon turned to feelings of humiliation and betrayal. It was the spring festival, and the woman he'd come back for had married only days after his return. This left him feeling that once again the people of the village were bullying him. He believed the villager he'd met on the bus lane just to make him lose face in front of his family and the village. He stayed at home for a time after his perceived humiliation, taking a job in a brick kiln, but soon left once more without saying a word. This time he headed south to Guangdong, a province that was attractive to migrant workers given the industrialization and the numerous jobs and factories on offer. However, there were strict controls over the migrant worker population. Even just leaving their factory premises without their identity cards would see workers arrested and held in detention centers. If people were discovered with the so-called 3 no's, which meant no registration, no work unit, and no accommodation, then they would be placed into special holding units until a family member could come with the necessary paperwork to prove their identity. Yang Xinhai fell under the regulations and wrote a letter to his father, asking him to come and get him out. More than willing to help his son, his father made the 1,300-kilometer journey south and got him released. His father begged him to come back home, but Yang Xinhai refused, saying he was better off by himself. In the years after leaving Guangdong, he drifted around various provinces, stealing to get by and make some kind of living. He decided that committing his acts of theft in more prosperous cities carried with it too much possibility of being caught and returned to prison, so he decided to target rural areas. There was virtually no police presence in villages, and the homes were easy to get into, often just having to use a knife to lift door latches. Around 1995, he returned to Hainan, in the city of Xianyang, around 100 kilometers from Zhumadian. He drifted around villages, stealing whatever he could, sometimes money. Sometimes the farm produce of villagers which he would sell at very low prices to get rid of it quickly. It was in this year that Yang Xinhai first attempted a more serious crime. He attacked a woman who was walking alone on a quiet country road. He tore the clothes off his victim and attempted to force himself on her. The woman fought back and sunk her teeth deep into the flesh of his face. The pain forced Yang Xinhai to back off, and the woman escaped unharmed. The attempted assault was reported to the police, and a short time later, when he was caught in the middle of a robbery, police noticed the still not fully healed wounds on the face of Yang Xinhai. He was arrested and later identified by the woman he attacked. The attempted assault had taken place in his home county of Zhengyang, and when in court to face sentencing for the assault and robbery, Yang Xinhai recognized the presiding judge as a villager from his hometown. He believed that the judge would treat him more leniently, but he was wrong, and he was sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp. After the sentence was handed down, he met with the judge and pleaded to be sent to a detention center rather than a labor camp. The judge told him there were 3 requirements for that. First, the sentence needed to be short, the crime non-violent, and the guilty suffering from an illness or disability. As he didn't meet any of those requirements, there was nothing the judge could do to help him. Yang Xinghai didn't believe his fellow villagers. He felt if his family had more money or better status in the village, he would have been treated better. He was sent to the labor camp, where he spent his time breaking rocks with a hammer. While he struggled with the physical labor, smashing rocks with a hammer all day would help him develop skills he would put to much more violent use in the future. He was released from the labor camp on May 31st, 1999. During his time inside, the only family member to visit him was a single time his father came to bring him some hometown food. Despite the number of times he walked away from his own family, he felt bitterness towards them for not showing enough concern about him. Having his freedom back, Yang Xinghai had no intention of turning his life around and changing his ways. He soon returned to drifting through the countryside, committing petty acts of theft as he wandered from village to village. On one occasion, he entered a home where the front door was left open. He found a woman sleeping alone. As he slid into the bed with her, the woman first assumed that it was her husband returning home from the fields. She soon realized she was wrong when Yang Xinghai began to violate her. The woman was too terrified to scream or fight back. Once he'd finished, Yang Xinghai left the home, stole a bicycle that was in the front yard, and moved on to the next village. In the winter of 1999, he would attack again, this time with a higher level of violence. At night, he entered a home where he'd seen an old woman living with what he assumed was her granddaughter. He attacked the older woman with a stick, knocking her unconscious, before binding her hands with some rope. He then struck the young girl in the head, knocking her to the ground. As she was trying to recover, Yang Xinghai pounced on the terrified child and kissed her. The girl fiercely resisted and bit hard into her attacker's tongue, tearing a chunk of it off. Yang Xinghai struck the girl in the head again, knocking her unconscious, but she was in so much pain and bleeding heavily from the mouth that he needed to leave and was unable to finish his assault. He stole 4 RMB the girl had in her pocket and made sure to pick up a piece of his tongue she'd spat out after tearing it off, which he disposed of in a nearby river. Due to his experience of being caught out by the bite of a victim, he didn't dare go to a hospital for treatment or even enter a pharmacy for medication. He dealt with his tongue himself, using raw egg whites to try and remedy the inflammation and pain. During his time trying to recover, he could barely speak or eat, and the injury had a lasting effect on his speech. By August of the year 2000, he'd sufficiently recovered to resume his criminal activity. In a village on the outskirts of the city of Anyang, he selected the home of a married couple. He entered at night and knocked the husband unconscious before binding his hands. The wife screamed at Yang Xinghai that they didn't keep any money in the home. He attacked the wife, knocking her out and tying her hands together. He then violated his unconscious victim. Both the man and woman would survive the assault, suffering only minor injuries. In his next attack in September, he would leave no survivors and truly become the monster of the Central Plains. Despite his early reluctance to confess to his crimes, as he was confronted with more evidence and was almost impressed by the work the police had put into the investigation, Yang Xinghai began to admit his guilt. And once he started talking, he wouldn't stop. The confession went on for hours, claiming his motivation was money, violating women, and revenge. When asked if he felt any remorse for any of his victims, he replied that he didn't ever think about them. He didn't attempt to give any justification as to why he ended their lives. He was also asked about what impact he thought his crimes had on society, to which he replied that society had nothing to do with him. What do you think about the past? Of course it's about women. What do you think about the past? Women. When I killed people, I just felt a kind of remorse in my heart. It was like that. As to whether they deserve to die or not, that's not my concern. If I didn't want to die, I wouldn't want to kill people. I don't want to kill people.
可能的主要动机还是为了，可能一个是为了钱，主要的还是一种报复心理。
什么报复心理？
就是强奸。
报复哪一方面？
当然是女人嘛。
报复对象？
女人嘛。说我在杀人的时候，我只是感觉到自己有一种那个心中一种欲念，处死过去，是这样。至于杀人，他们该不该死，那都不是我关心的问题。我也不和社会，我好像脱离社会，我不关心社会上，我不给人热闹，社会对我怎么样？
Yang Xinghai was charged with 23 different cases and 67 intentional homicides, although he later stated that he ended the lives of more than 70 people. During his interrogation, there was a moment where he seemed to show some remorse for what he did, almost breaking down into tears. That glimmer of humanity didn't last long. On November 12, 2003, he was transferred to a detention center to await his trial as investigators further investigated his case. While detained, he was under constant watch by armed guards and had his legs and arms shackled with chains always weighing 20 kilos, except when eating or sleeping. He requested the opportunity to write a memoir of his crimes so that it could be studied by criminal psychologists, but he was refused access to any writing implements. Other inmates in the jail were especially scared of him. They knew who he was and what he was accused of, and many gave him a wide berth. Yang Xinhai seemed to revel in his notoriety. It may have been through fear rather than the respect he believed he deserved all his life, but he felt people no longer looked down on him. Former cellmates of his would later say how Yang Xinhai would happily go into detail about the crimes he committed, paying special attention to his violations of his female victims. The only thing he wouldn't talk about was why he usually violated them after death. On February 1, 2004, the monster Yang Xinhai faced trial. On seeing the large number of armed officers there to escort him, he smiled and praised the work they were doing. According to the officers with him, he laughed and joked on the journey to the court and was impressed by the level of security around him. He faced hours of questioning by the presiding judges and was able to go through the circumstances of each charge in detail. After starting at around 7:20 in the morning and ending at 7:30 in the evening, Yang Xinhai was found guilty of all charges and handed the death sentence. He was informed he had 10 days to appeal the sentence but responded that there was no need, he wasn't going to dispute the judgment. When asked if he wanted to see any of his family before the sentence was carried out, he gave a simple and stern no in reply. On February 14, 2004, Yang Xinhai was executed by gunshot. His final words were, "I deserve it. It is unreasonable to kill so many and let me live." After his execution, the family of Yang Xinhai, out of shame, refused to claim the cremated remains of their son and brother, who became one of the most prolific and feared monsters in the history of mankind. With at least 67 bodies, numerous women and girls violated, and multiple generations of families annihilated, the damage done by the nihilistic crime spree of the monster was felt long after his conviction and execution. The few surviving victims had to deal with the pain and distress of what they went through and losing the people closest to them. The small, close-knit village communities, where many people would have been in some way related to the victims, were left traumatized for years. The two men who were falsely accused by police, Yang Deli and Chu Jikuo, were essentially ostracized and treated with fear and suspicion by their communities. His parents were left devastated by the actions of the monster. They told reporters that he was an honest, hard-working boy as a child. In one interview, the father took the blame for the devastation his son caused, saying, "I am a sinner to have produced a child like that. Please take care of yourself and your loved ones." We will be back with another mysterious true crime documentary.